Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to another one of my episodes of William Wallace for America. I am William Wallace, as I like to say. And with me today is my guest, Daniel Greenfield. And I'm going to let him tell you about what he does, where he works. And then we're going to talk a little about what he does, how he got there, which I think you're going to find extremely interesting. But we're going to talk about a lot of things like how conservative values cross party lines and how it's used against some people. We're also going to talk a little bit about everything, all the hot news items. But I think in this interview, just by getting to know Daniel a little bit, you're going to find some very interesting facts that you didn't know before. Daniel, thank you so much for being on today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
So where do you write for a newspaper? But you're very involved in the movement. I'd like for you to tell us a little bit about where you work.
Well, I have the honor of working for David Horowitz, who was a former leftist who absolutely switched gears when he encountered the reality of the Black Panthers,
Mhm.
which was a racist terrorist group that, by the way, Black Lives Matter today absolutely worships. The Shillman Journalism Fellow there at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. And most of my writing, and much of our work in general, appears at frontpagemag.com, Front Page Magazine.
Awesome. And I'm gonna let you repeat some of that throughout the show because that way, when people find out some of the things that you write about and all the facts that you have about it, I think they're going to be more interested in reading more of your articles and being more involved with it, possibly. So, but I got to tell everybody, you don't live in a very conservative area, right?
I'm afraid not. Originally, I was in New York City. Then I'm currently right now in LA and looking to escape California, along with the flood of refugees getting the hell out of California. For the first time in history, California actually lost a seat. New York and California have been shrinking. Again, this is a record. This is something that had not happened before. Florida and Texas are growing. New York and California are shrinking. Really, this is the demographic picture of the United States, which is that these bastions of power, wealth, and privilege are actually driving the middle class out. They're driving out a lot of Americans. And the places that people are going to are places like Florida and Texas, where people can actually live a normal life.
I love to hear that how California actually lost a seat. It actually gives them less say at the table in our Congress, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Their obsession with repressing everybody, with imposing top-down rule out of Sacramento is backfiring because so many people are getting out. If they'd actually maintained some facade of moderation, if they tolerated Republicans, at least to some degree, a lot of these people would have stayed. If they hadn't destroyed the cities, they'd actually have more influence. They're losing their own influence as a result.
It's kind of interesting the way you say that because their own policies are destroying their power, and they don't realize that their policies are destroying their power. I just hope that when they move to Texas and Florida, that they don't take their policies with them and change those states into what California is today.
Now, that is the big problem. It's the big challenge because so many of these people, they see the dysfunction, but they don't recognize the underlying political causes of that. And so they repeat the process. They vote for the very same people they left behind. Hopefully, this kind of outrage, the backlash over things like forced masking in schools, a lot of the hypocrisy surrounding that, has woken up some people who were very much firmly ensconced in voting for this kind of destructive stuff. But at the same time, there are people who are conservative. There are plenty of conservatives out here, and they obviously know what the score is, and they're going to places like Arizona, Nevada, and Florida because they do know what the score is. But you do have people who are suburban, upper middle class, who really identify as liberal and who don't really have not made this reckoning with just what it is they're fleeing, why they're escaping high taxes, high crime, social dysfunction, and tracing it back to just what is going on in these cities and what is going on in this country.
Do you think that a lot of them realize that, I guess we let's look at the percentages, all these ones that are escaping California and even some of New York, I wonder if they realize that, oops, my ideologies are what has made California or New York what it is today. I'm gonna move to Texas and I'm gonna leave my ideologies behind, or do some of them just not realize, that they create that their ideological behaviors or voting patterns are what has created an environment that they're hating and running from?
Many of them don't realize, in part because you don't tend to see, particularly in the mainstream media, any serious discussion of what is going on. And when you do see it, it is very buried, it is very sidelined. The narrative front and center is meant to leave people in the dark, is meant to repeat the same cliches. I mean, for example, LA is going to be spending billions more after having spent billions on homeless services, and yet nobody ever wonders why we actually have more homeless than we used to.
Because their policies keep allowing more and more homeless people to just live on the streets. Um, now, what I find interesting and something I like to talk about is, and I've said this a little earlier, is that I believe that conservative values actually unite more people than divide. In today's world, I know I told you this, earlier. In today's world, the narrative from the left is that conservatives are evil, racist, hated, right? Hateful bigots. However, I think that I have Democrat friends who are more conservative than some of our Republican friends, but conservative values don't have to be a far right wing ideology. They're actually more of, compassion, caring, fiscal responsibility, that actually makes our communities safe places. And we unite on that. But the other thing that I want to comment on before I let you, because I know you have a lot to say on this, because I've heard about some of your writings, is freedom. And I think that if we as Americans started uniting more on freedom instead of ideologies and be respectful of each other's freedoms, then we would also get policies, out of just a bonding on freedom that would, create not only safe environments, but a respect for each other where we're not always fighting over whose ideology is bigger or
No,
better.
it's absolutely true. And if you poll people on values, you will see that there are far more people who poll as conservative on values, even using that word, than liberal on values. And this is particularly true in the Black community, where you have far more people who say that they are conservative socially than who say that they are liberal. And this has always been a fundamental mismatch. But one of the things that's going on there is that people tend to think in terms of ideology, yet their personal lives are in another sphere. So in their personal lives, as you said, they can be quite conservative. They have family values. They will pursue attaining and amassing wealth the traditional sort of way. Yet at the same time, when it comes to the wider country, they will embrace a set of values that they would not actually apply to themselves. When it comes to their own children, they wouldn't let their own children, for example, just live on the street and take drugs. But when it comes to the homeless crisis, which we were discussing, they're fine with that. So there's a
Yeah.
basic disconnect there. It's a mismatch. It's a very tragic mismatch. And it's important for people to actually connect the way that they live their personal lives with the way that the larger society lives its lives. And, that is a huge challenge. Sometimes it's reversed among conservatives. There are people who are politically conservative, but not actually conservative in their own lives. And there are people on the left, well, not really in the left, but liberals who are conservative when it comes to how they live their lives. But when it comes to the rest of society, well, they think that they're being very compassionate and empathetic by dismantling standards, by saying that the government should step in and control people's lives. And this really is kind of an act of contempt, because what you're saying is, I have self-control. I have the ability to run my life the way it should. But those people don't, and the government needs to take care of them. The government needs to tell them what to do. And this is kind of feudalism, really, rather than anything compassionate.
What's interesting about what you're saying is that it's I can control, like from a liberal point of view, like you're saying is, most liberals will say I can control my own destiny, I can control my life, I can control my freedoms, but those people over there can't. So I'm going to support the government coming in and controlling them in certain ways. I'll support and this is what they're saying, of course. I'll let the government come in and help them, and I don't mind paying the taxes for the government to help them, and I'll support them and help them in their endeavors of homelessness or drug use or whatever the case may be. But what they're not realizing is that while they empower the government to do those things and the government creates laws, it ends up coming back to bite them in the rear ends, because it affects them also. They have to live by those same policies that are being created by the politicians that they're giving the control to. And it's almost like they don't even realize it. It's almost like they feel like, hey, I'm going to give the government control over those people, but it's not going to affect me. But then when it does, they blame it on somebody else.
Well, unfortunately, the problem is in many cases it doesn't actually affect them. Three examples. One is obviously crime. Some of the people who finance the stuff, the pro-crime movement, police defunding, they live in gated communities. They live in well-isolated areas that have excellent police protection.
Hmm.
Facebook, some of their founders have been the big funders of this stuff. Facebook has its own private police force of, I believe, over 1,000 people.
Oh, wow, I
Um,
didn't know that.
yeah, they even set up their own. They had a public-private partnership to set up a special police station to protect their headquarters. So they will see to it that they are well taken care of. Take gun control, for example. The push is you have to ban guns. You can't just let these people have guns. But so many of the people who actually advocate for gun control, either they own firearms themselves or they have
Right.
armed security, especially if they're wealthy or celebrities, and they see that as completely differently because I can be responsible as a gun owner. My private security is going to be responsible as gun owners,
Mhm.
but we don't want those people because those people can't be trusted. And this is true across the board. They have one set of standards for themselves, and they are insulated from the things that they do to the rest of society. And they will actually insist that, again, those people should live by those sets of rules. The government should control them, but it's not going to affect them. Of course, eventually, as you've said, in the long run, it does affect them. You can only insulate yourself so much. I took a look at the current CEO of Amazon, Angie Jassy, very
Right.
left wing, support all the anti-police stuff. Amazon, as you know, is based out of Seattle. His home is actually not that far from Chop Chaz, the occupied zone there. But you
Right.
look at his house, it looks very nice, but there's a huge disguised fence that goes like 20 feet. There are floodlights. He lives himself in an armed fortress. And,
Wow.
at the same time, he supports policies that are completely destructive to the small business owners that are there near Chop Chaz when it was there. And those small business owners, many of them minority, had their shops ruined. They had their businesses wiped out.
Mm.
So these people have managed to insulate themselves from the consequences of these policies. During the height of the pandemic, these were the people who got out as fast as they could. They were fine with the lockdowns, but of course,
Right.
they got themselves to their summer homes, to their
Yeah.
yachts, to their private islands, and they were lecturing everybody else about how to do things. Meanwhile, businesses were going bankrupt again, left and right.
Our own mayor here in New Orleans. Now, I live in a suburb outside of New Orleans, about a couple miles from New Orleans. However, it affects us, tremendously. But the mayor here in New Orleans actually has been a big mask mandate person,
Mm-hmm.
vaccine mandate person. And they have pictures of her at the
Mm-hmm.
mayor's Mardi Gras ball just a couple days ago. And you see, people in the room hugging each other, talking to each other, and not a single one of them have mask on.
Yeah,
Rules for thee, but not for me.
yeah.
Now,
I was just looking at those pictures.
now you said a little while, a minute ago, that there are three areas that does not affect the people who want government to control things. One was crime. One was Second Amendment. Did I miss the third one, or was it kind of blended
Well,
in one of those?
you just actually kind of mentioned it. The pandemic restrictions.
Yeah.
It really did not affect those people because they get out because they're insulated from it. And even when they're in the cities, as you pointed out, I was looking at those same pictures. We saw pictures like that out of DC. We saw pictures like that out of the Super Bowl
Right.
in LA. Our current mayor Garcetti claimed that he was holding his breath. And you see him in pictures all over the place. You saw Mayor Bowser in DC. You saw Mayor
Hmm.
Breed. And the amazing thing is when they're confronted on it, they will just act indignant. You're being the mask police. They are
Right.
literally the mask police, yet they act indignant when you ask them to abide by the rules that everyone else is abiding by. But again,
Exactly.
when you have power, you don't have to live by those rules. And this is the problem. The people who actually are imposing those rules, who have the disproportionate power to force all this on us, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's anything else, they do not live by their rules. We do not have a system of equal justice. We have a set of double standards.
And what's interesting is how now, whether the timing is because of decreases in the COVID and Omicron, or is it that the midterms are coming up pretty soon and they simply want people to forget about all their mandates.
They are absolutely following the science. And by following the science, I mean they're following the polling science. They've looked at all the polls. The polls are absolutely catastrophic for them. 66% of Democrats want to get back to normal. When I talk to people who are Democrats, who are liberals, who are very fanatical about this 2 years ago, now they're over and done with it. They don't trust the CDC. They don't trust any of
Mhm.
these guidelines. Of course, everything they're doing now is just creating more distrust.
Right.
But they want to be done with it. They wanted to be done with it really a year ago. 6 months ago, it just reached the catastrophic point, and we see this preference cascade kick in, where everybody just wants out. Just except for Joy Behar, who wants to wear a
Yeah.
mask forever. But she's not wearing a mask in the studio when she's
Right.
on the set. So these people are hypocrites. A lot of this mask stuff was virtue signaling. It was not sincere. Bottom line is, people wanted out, and so they flipped on it. And that's the bottom line. They're admitting this was always political. This was always about what their base wanted, what political gain they could gain from this. It was never about the science.
Yeah, and for me, I'll never deny. I'll always say, look, I get that the virus was a real thing. I think that the way government stepped in and controlled and tried to do the mandates and control people as a result of it, I think is the political part. Because when you look at it, we could look back and see and look at the flu. I mean, we could apply the same things to the flu in years gone by. People died of the flu, people got sick, how it passed, how it was transmitted. You look at tuberculosis. Tuberculosis affects about 10 million people a year, and nobody is talking about tuberculosis. There's a lot of other things, but I think they just use this one to manipulate people. And that's why I step in against it. I'm not a denier of the COVID of COVID. I'm simply one that says, I think the government got too involved, blew it up too much, made it a lot of people scared, and used scare tactics and narratives to control people to be able to get things in place, like mandates and vaccines that are paid for by the government, which actually they're not free. The government doesn't pay for it. We pay for it. And, meanwhile, you can see that in the top 5 stocks traded by Congress, 2 of them are the pharmaceutical companies that are producing the vaccine. So when you look at those kind of things, it's very obvious to me.
The big story, the big picture of this is that there's been a growing shift away from the power of elected officials,
Mhm.
of the people who actually are the voters, to the administrative state, to bureaucrats. And the
Right.
pandemic radically accelerated that. We have unelected bureaucrats that are calling the shots. For example, in LA, who decides if we actually can open or not? Well, a lady named Barbara Ferrer, who was never elected by anybody. So public health officials, and they're bureaucrats. In some cases, they have MPHs, which means they have a master's in public health administration.
Mhm.
They're not scientists, they're administrators. They gained immense power, and the bureaucracy gained immense power. This is really the big picture here. And it's part of something that's been going on now, unfortunately, for generations. The conservative movement in America in the 20th century was really, in part, arose as a response to that, particularly in the FDR era. And the crisis has really reached epic proportions. We see what's going on in Canada, obviously.
Right.
When you actually turn over power to an unelected bureaucracy, this is what happens. You lose all your human rights, you lose your constitutional rights, you lose your ability to do anything about it. Now, as far as the pandemic goes, we knew from the very beginning who were the most vulnerable. Those were people who were elderly, who were compromised,
Mhm.
particularly if they had asthma, if they had any kind of lung issues. Those were the people who did much of the dying. Those are the people we should have been protecting. What did the same public health bureaucracy do? Did they protect those people? They shut down businesses, they shut down schools, yet they actually forced, in multiple states, they forced infected COVID patients into nursing homes, killing
Right.
tens of thousands of people. They did this in New York, they did this in California, they did this in New Jersey, they did this in Pennsylvania, they did this across the country with entirely foreseeable consequences. So, how do you understand this? They actively engaged in behavior that killed tens of thousands of senior citizens in a completely foreseeable way. Yet at the same time, they shut down society for the people who are the least vulnerable, especially children. They sacrificed the most vulnerable, and yet they restricted the least vulnerable.
That's a great way to put it very succinctly. So I want to wrap up that thought on that, because I really want to get to some of the articles that you've written recently that I think a lot of people would really enjoy reading and seeing what you've got and what you produce, because I think it's very interesting. I had the opportunity to hear you in person talk about your articles when you're here in New Orleans, and that's really one of the things I want to talk about to get our listeners to hear, to learn more about you. What was your most recent article?
So the article that's currently up now actually addresses the critical situation of critical race theory, wokeness in the military. This began very aggressively under Obama. Obama actually signed an order basically making diversity into the mission of the military. And when they say diversity, I mean the armed forces are the most diverse American institution. They were diverse for going back generations. It was a place where you had black kids and white kids coming together serving our country. What they mean by diversity is, first of all, quota system. Second of all, critical race theory. You have to do things like pursue unconscious biases, which basically means telling white people that they're racist, and telling black people and minorities that they're victims of racism, and you're going to raise their consciousness. You're going to get them to discover, even if they don't know that they're victims, you're going to teach them that they're victims. And this is something
Right.
that began to be pushed very aggressively after the whole Black Lives Matter riots broke out. The various branch service leaders began pushing this across different branches. They had something called critical conversations.
Hmm.
Now, you know what's going on with the actual functioning of the military, because they said that doing this diversity, equity, inclusion would actually improve our military readiness. In fact, our military readiness is now very poor. The Air Force, which is arguably the second most woke of the established branches, is now showing really horrible readiness rates for core aircraft. Under the Trump administration, the metric was you had to have 75, 80% readiness for aircraft. When Secretary of Defense Austin came in under Biden, he said, he basically said, we're not even going to do the 80% or 75%. It's not viable. We're going to pursue a more holistic view. When you actually break it down across different classes of aircraft, the numbers actually become catastrophic. It's about 70% total. But for example, on the F-22s, it's about 50% or so, which is pretty much a coin flip. Now, the Biden administration made a big show of sending the F-22s to the Pacific Theater. They said this was the most number of F-22s they deployed in the Pacific Theater. But how intimidated is China going to be when your planes are basically have the readiness rate of a coin flip? The F-35 numbers are horrible. The B-1 bombers are just, it's been between 10 and 40%. It's disastrous. And this is the basic reality. We're not ready to actually for a confrontation with China. We are not ready for a confrontation with any serious military power because, again, we've let particularly the Air Force and the Navy, the equipment and the morale deteriorate horribly.
And all of this is because they're focusing on wokeness, equity, instead of training for military maneuvers or military confrontations, which is their sole purpose. And I like what you said earlier that our military has been diversified, for many generations. It's been very, very integrated for generations. I mean, I remember my time in the Army that that when I went through boot camp, there was all kinds of people, and this is way back when we didn't care about what color you were. We trained together. We knew our differences, but we trained together and learned combat ready maneuvers. And nowadays, if they're just sending you to class to learn how to be more equitable or how to be more fair or woke instead of being ready for China or Russia, we're in trouble.
We're in big trouble. The service branch academies, like the Air Force Academy in particular, are horribly bad. The stuff that they're teaching the people who are going to be the leaders of tomorrow is catastrophic. It's the same things you can see on campuses. Now, we like to think that the service branch academies are different than college campuses. In fact, one of the things that the Clinton administration did was they actually forced them to start hiring civilian professors, which meant the same people who were destroying our college campuses, academia, the Ivy League, and so forth, actually went into the service branch academies, and they've been actually wrecking them. And beyond that, you have people who are actually supposed to be leaders, who are supposed to be focusing on readiness, are instead dividing people. They're dividing people by race. They're focusing everything on diversity and equity as their mission instead of actually being prepared to win the war. And we see the consequences of that in the services. We see the consequences of that just on the battlefield.
Unbelievable. What's another article that you've written lately?
Well, one of my recent pieces actually examined what's behind the push to get critical race theory into schools. And this is something that most people don't take a look at. For example, three major racialist authors that people probably have heard of: Ibram X. Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, author of White Fragility, and Ta-Nehisi Coates. So these are really the three big ones. They've been on the bestseller lists, and they are actually all products of the same publisher, Penguin Random House. It's the largest publisher in the world, and these used to be American companies. Certainly, Random House used to be an American company. Um,
Who owns it now?
and now it's owned by a German conglomerate, Bertelsmann, which actually has a Nazi past. Back in the day, they would publish things like the Christmas book of the Hitler Youth. Basically, one of the things that has happened to American publishing, it is no longer American. Most American publishing companies are now owned by either one of two German conglomerates, Bertelsmann and Holzenbrick, or Legrand, which is French. Now, this is something that happened. Most Americans are not aware of it. This is also happening in the food sector, where the big food brands are being bought up by international companies, but it's happened a while back within the publishing industry. So one reason why are the books that we're seeing so horrible? Why is our publishing industry seemingly so hostile to America? Well, one reason is it's actually owned by Europeans who are very left wing. Now, the CEO of Penguin Random House, a German fellow by the name of Markus Stoll, announced that he's putting forward $500,000 to fight against efforts to keep critical race theory out of schools. Now, Penguin Random House itself is pushing books like those by Kendi, by Coates, by D'Angelo into schools. They've got an educational arm, so they're literally making money from this. And this is currently the world's largest publisher. They have an immense amount of power, and they're really buying up what's left of American publishing. They're trying to buy up Simon & Schuster, which would give them even more clout and even more reach in terms of academic publishing into schools, into colleges, universities, all levels of education. So this is something that is not just coming out of nowhere. There's the world's largest publisher is behind this, and they're coming out of the shadows in pushing for this. They're saying to parents, if you try to actually keep critical race theory out of schools, we're going to come after you. We have the money, we have the resources, we have the power.
And who was it you said is now fighting against keeping it out of schools?
So that's the CEO of Penguin Random House. Now, fun fact about Penguin Random House, when you see these politicians score insane book deals, 10 million, 20 million that they can never repay, Penguin Random House had a 65 million deal with the Obamas. They were responsible for the huge, I think, $5 million deal with Cuomo, which was never going to be paid back. There was no way he was going to sell enough books to do that. And you have to ask, what are these politicians giving in exchange for that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It's just another form of money laundering. It's going back to the vaccine for a second. It's no different than the elected officials are creating these free vaccines, for people that the government's paying for, or our tax dollars are paying for, we're paying for, and then they buy the stock from the pharmaceutical companies, and then they make thousands, if not, hundreds of thousands of dollars off the vaccines that they, quasi kind of mandated, got paid for to give away for free, paid for by the government. So they're taking tax dollars through government, through government money, and investing their own personal money into the stocks and getting rich off of it. And now I'm sure there's ways that these book people are getting enough money to be able to pay the politicians. It's just another form of money laundering almost. What do you think about that?
Well, Washington, D.C., or as I call it, the Imperial City, is very much a concentration of incredibly corrupt special interests. So this is just a basic reality. I mean, take Jeff Bezos, the former CEO of Amazon. He decided some years back to buy the Washington Post, which was losing money, for $250 million out of the goodness of his heart. Did he do that out of the goodness of his heart?
No.
No. Amazon actually makes billions of dollars from government contracts, and it started making a whole lot more money after Bezos bought the Washington Post. And the Washington Post is the ultimate government paper. If you want your political agenda to be pushed forward, having it appear in the Washington Post is a huge plus. So Jeff made a very, very smart investment. He's a very smart investor. And there are a lot of guys in a lot of industries who are making very smart investments. And there are different ways of motivating politicians, of getting them to do things. And obviously, giving them a multi-million-dollar book contract is definitely a good way of motivating politicians.
That's an extremely good point, on that. But now back to CRT for a minute. It's pushed. The narrative is we're going to teach fairness, we're going to teach equity, we're going to teach, history that hasn't been taught before. And many people of all colors are getting on board, going, yeah, that's a good thing. Teaching fairness and equity. They don't realize that equity is actually not about equality. It's about equality just for certain groups and not for everybody. and they don't realize the true meaning of equity. They get it confused with equality. So therefore they start supporting, oh, well, what's wrong with teaching, white children that, that we wronged them, or that slaves were, wronged by, and then all of a sudden it helps push the use. I'll just say this. It's almost like the useful idiots are helping push the agenda of the left, or the people who want CRT, as a way to diminish the strength of anybody, where now, instead of lifting people up, where they're pushing down larger portions of society. Because if you make Black people feel like they're oppressed and there's no way to get out of the oppression, and you make white people feel guilty for the wrongs of generations ago that might have happened to be white, you're not just oppressing one group, you're oppressing a lot of people that are going to be impressionable in the future, when government wants to convince them that they need to just be more submissive about their freedoms and liberties to a government that's helping them. Would you say that's true?
That's perfectly put. If you want to control people, two things you need to do. First of all, teach them that they're helpless, that they can't change their circumstances. And second of all, divide them, make sure they can't be in groups, splinter them, keep them in tribes, keep them fighting each other. This is not some sort of conspiracy theory. This was how empires always ruled. They would go into,
Right.
when we're looking at, for example, at the situation in Eastern Europe, Russia, the Ukraine, or for example, the Middle East, part of this was because there were generations of conquerors, and they would take these little groups of people, they would pit them against each other, and they would actually control and dominate an empire, because they understood that if everybody got together against them, they would be able to kick them out. But if they keep everybody fighting each other, then they can actually rule. And this was one difference with the American Revolution. Americans actually stood together for the most part and fought against the British, whereas when the British actually ruled other places, well, they would keep everybody fighting each other. They would keep the Hindus and the Muslims fighting each other in India, and that would allow them to remain in power.
That's a great thought, and I love that you brought that up, because there's a lot of I've got Republican conservative minded friends. I won't even air quote that, that are like, oh, this is conspiracy thinking. There's nothing of that going on, but there's books about this through history, and like you said, this is not something that somebody's inventing right now. There's historical books, historical writings that show that governments divide people for control. And not only books, but there's, like you said, there's times in history that you can point to. There's leaders, there's rulers, and there's countries that follow these same techniques to do this. So that's a great point. So Daniel, what other what's another article that you might want to point to that people would be interested in reading?
Well, I have done a variety of pieces, including on the insane situation we were discussing at the beginning with the homelessness in LA.
Yeah.
In theory, you would think it's a matter of housing. I mean, you've got the somewhat more conservative candidate in the mayor's race now running ads saying, he can build enough housing. Well, as it turns out, you cannot build enough housing
Right.
for the same reasons we were talking about, which is political corruption. So, how much do you think building an apartment for the homeless ought to cost? Just dollar figure.
$1 billion, hundreds of millions.
No, just for one apartment for one homeless person.
Oh, I don't know, $100,000.
Well, they've managed to run it to $750,000
For one person.
Yes, for one apartment. So, I mean, they had measures and they raised taxes amounting to several $billion. Of course, the money ran out because yes, they're spending $750,000. Where was the money going? A lot of it was going to consultants, which is really where a lot of the money goes. For
Right.
example, if you recall back in the day when Cory Booker was still mayor of Newark and Mark Zuckerberg was younger and he was the CEO of Facebook, and he said he was going to fix Newark public schools. Newark is a completely broken city composed of slums. Anyway, Zuckerberg, I believe, came in with about $100 million. And that should be enough to fix Newark. Newark is not that big of a city. It should be enough to fix their public schools. The money vanished in months. That's how it works. Now, when they ran out of money for the $750,000 apartments, they decided to begin building 8x8 sheds. How much should an 8x8 shed cost? Do you want to hazard a guess?
I mean, you could probably, because I come from a building industry kind of background, you could probably go to Home Depot and buy an 8x8 shed for probably around $3,000 or $4,000.
It was costing them 100,000. Now, since that didn't work out, they had a great plan. The homeless are living in tents, so they were going to actually set up the tents and manage tent camping sites. Now, the homeless before were living in tents for free. Do you know what their new tent policy cost?
No, what?
They cost 2,700 per month per tent. Now, this is the cost of a luxury apartment, a month's rent in a luxury apartment. Now they're
Exactly.
paying that money for to have them live in tents, which they're already doing, but now they're living in government tents. So now those tents cost 2,700 a month.
You see, this is where the insanity just continues. I often point to our national debt, and while people kind of go, "Oh yeah, the national debt's up," it's up there, it's pretty high. Nobody really connects the dots. And when you look at the national debt, I always tell people that think that people like me who are saying that our freedoms and liberties are under attack, and they go, "Oh, that's conspiracy thinking." I always say, look at our national debt. Our national debt has risen more in just the last 10 years than it has in the last previous 200 years of our country. And when you look at the policies that they're creating more and more of today, like the ones that you're mentioning, where it's $2,700 to live in a government tent, that's just proof positive that they're not watching their spending. And the reason I think it's more intentional, because like you said, you get consultants involved, i.e., pay off the people that are supporting you and helping you helping stuff the ballot boxes. And you see, I snuck that in, election integrity stuff, which I'll ask you about that in a second. And these policies are just racking up. They're destroying cities, they're destroying states, and eventually they're going to destroy our country. And we're going to pay for it, out of our freedom bank account. And eventually, when the debt is so big, because because government spent $2,700 a month on tents, nobody's gonna be able to afford to live in a tent. Would you say that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And where is all that money going? Much of it is actually funding the left. This is how the left gets funded. This is how these political interests move money around, and they're stealing from taxpayers on a massive scale. The national debt you mentioned that has actually passed $30 trillion for the first time. It's an unimaginably catastrophic figure. Once interest rates go up, and at this point, for all the stalling that the Fed is doing, they're going to have to go up. Those numbers become absolutely catastrophic. We're looking at over 1 trillion just to service the interest on the debt. We're talking unimaginable money. And much of that actually, again, we were talking about the pandemic, about 6-7 trillion of that was pandemic spending. Much of it, 30-40% actually was just fraud. Some of it by foreign criminals, actually. A good chunk of that money was stolen by various foreign criminal groups because there was absolutely no accountability. Anybody could file for anything unless they were completely outrageous about it. No, again, there's another story I recently did, which is about the exposure of this massive Somali Muslim fraud network in Minneapolis. And they actually had gotten so insanely greedy, they were claiming 200 million, over 200 million in reimbursements for feeding supposedly poor children. Now, they were feeding more poor children than there were probably in the whole state. They started small with a few million. They did 40 million. Then they got so out of control because they were getting away with it that they were claiming 200 million. It was entirely insane. And of course, whenever they were challenged on it, they screamed racism. And the FBI actually went in there. They monitored these places where they're supposedly feeding 50,000 people a day, and there was absolutely nobody there. But this is the death of 1,000, a million, a billion, a trillion cuts. We're being ripped off left and right. We're being ripped off across every major city. Every single politician is playing the same stupid, crooked games, even when they claim they're not, because this is how the system works. The system is one in which you actually run for office, promising to pay people who are actually donating to you. And I don't mean the rank and file people, the people who are sending you a donation, but the people who actually are putting in the big money for the stuff. It's a
Right.
pay-to-play system. It works this way locally, but it really works this way nationally. And the national government has an insane amount of money to play with. Social Security was supposed to be protecting people's retirements. It was a plan supposedly to take people and say, you're not going to be homeless in your old age. You're not going to be put out on the street. We're going to take care of you. the Social Security that's being taken out of your check is not actually going to Social Security. It is a loan that you're giving to the government. It is effectively a government tax. All this is going to kick in very soon because actually the date of Social Security's default has moved up by a year during this whole fraudulent mess. And meanwhile, Medicare hospital repayments are scheduled to run out, I believe, by 2026 at this point, at which point we're going to see really catastrophic things. We have massive unfunded pension liabilities at the national level, at the local level, at the statewide level. Cities are going to go bankrupt. The bonds that are going to be sold are becoming junk bonds. They're being artificially maintained. The Obama administration was very aggressive in warning credit rating agencies that if you call out our shenanigans, as Biden likes to say, we are going to come after you. We're going to make your life miserable. This is fraud. It's a massive fraud. We're now at 30 trillion, and we're only going to go higher because nobody is seriously committed to stopping this insane machine.
Especially when government's answer to paying their bills is just printing more money.
Exactly.
Government's answer is, oh, we got to do Build Back Better. We can't afford it, but we're going to borrow it. You're going to vote for it. We're going to borrow it. And only a small percentage of it is actually going to go to building roads and bridges. The other percentage of it is going to go to groups that we owe favors to, or go to groups that we know will help us get reelected in the future, or go to groups that we want to make sure they have more of those kind of people here, because that's going to be impressionable voters that are going to live off the system and still vote for us, in the words of LBJ, right?
Exactly. And the left is now pushing modern monetary theory, which goes beyond quantitative easing to basically say we can print as much money. The United States government has the currency. All we need to do is print the money and we'll pay for it. And this is not some sideline crackpot idea. This has been embraced. The New York Times had a high-profile piece on Stephanie Kelton, who's the big proponent of modern monetary theory. Bernie Sanders, AOC have all pushed MMT. And this is basically Venezuela-type stuff where the government just prints as much money as it takes to fulfill their agendas. And increasingly, we're completely untethered. Manchin, who is a Democrat, Senator Manchin, was being treated like a crazy person for just saying, we need to talk about how we're going to pay for this.
Exactly.
Even 10 years ago, Democrats would at least talk about how we're going to pay for this. Now, that's not even a conversation. It's becoming a very California model where the legislature here actually passed universal health care, and there was absolutely no way to pay for it. There was no plan attached to pay for it. And when the actual Senate said, wait a minute, we can't pass this because we have no plan to pay for this, of course, they threw a fit, they screamed racism, and they lost their minds. And this is just a normative routine now. We're not even allowed to discuss how we're going to pay for anything. That's not even part of the conversation. Instead, modern monetary theory, as they call it, will magically just create endless amounts of money because we have printing machines, so we can just print the money. Or they have their great plan to mint $1 trillion coin. Have you heard this one?
No, it's this.
Yeah. So there's a loophole in a piece of legislation which allowed the government to create commemorative coins. Now, the government was meant to be minting commemorative coins in order to, make money selling $10, $20, $50 coins. But they found a loophole because it never says that the government can't mint $1 trillion coin. So, of course, they began proposing all that Obama has to do or Biden has to do is mint $1 trillion coin, and he can spend as much money as he wants. He can just keep minting $1 trillion coins. This is, of course, blatantly illegal. It's blatantly unconstitutional. But at some point they are going to do this.
Right. Well, that and like you said, it's kind of neat having a machine that prints a product that doesn't cost you anything to print it, but you get paid dividends on when people use it, i.e., the Federal Reserve is printing money. And look, I understand that it's kind of a love-hate relationship, if you will. That the Federal Reserve was created, and there's a lot of people against the Federal Reserve. I'm not even going to join in on that argument, whether I agree or disagree or not, because the Federal Reserve creates our money. I think that it had a purpose and still has somewhat of a purpose. But the problem is that our politicians have become so reckless in using the Federal Reserve. So what I'm trying to get to is there's a lot of people that blame the Federal Reserve for our financial problems, when the real problem is that our elected officials are spending money, through the Federal Reserve and not being responsible with it. And I believe that if our government really changed its practices and spent within its means, and we, the people, require our government to live within its means, there's a balance there that businesses are able to make money. People are able to make money. Our government lives within its means. Our country being healthier slows down inflation, and everybody does better. Like everybody will do better and prosper under that type of system. And then the fat cats can still make their money. And I have nothing against that because they are creating jobs for people. As long as the system is within its bounds and living within its means, and I think that's the problem. Our politicians are just living outside their means, and they're spending other people's money, and making our grandchildren pay for it.
Yeah, at this rate, even our great grandchildren won't be able to pay for it because the numbers are absolutely catastrophic. But we need drastic budgeting reform. In the past, there's been a push for that. Ross Perot pushed for it. Anybody who understands budgeting at all understands that this is a completely insane crisis. The way we're spending money is unsustainable. And we can't even begin to pay for the spending that actually is going on a regular basis. Yet the response from everybody, Democrats, Republicans, is just spend more money. This is the game in Congress. This is what bipartisanship is. Don't go away angry. We'll put in your budgeting priorities. We'll put in your budgeting priorities,
Right.
and we'll have some absolutely fake math as to how we're going to actually get this money. Because, as Obama liked to say, these are investments. It's not spending, it's investments. They're investing in nothing,
Right.
except, of course, their own special interest. But we need to drastically cut down the size of budgets. We at one point we got to the point where $100 billion budget was normal, a $200 billion budget was normal, a $1 trillion budget, $2 trillion, $4 trillion, $5 trillion. We see this also locally in states. It's completely runaway escalating spending. And of course, we're dealing with inflation
Right.
because we're just spending endless amounts of money. So of course, what's a trillion? What's 2 trillion? What's 10 trillion? When your starting point is you need $2 trillion just to get to the table, then of course.
In the case of the United States, we're already at 3 trillion. What's another trillion or two?
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think is gonna happen? What do you think is the answer? Do you have an idea for that?
I mean, we need a political revolution. I know that we're going to have a political revolution because alternatively, the same thing that happens to everybody. If somebody actually just keeps spending money on credit cards that they can't pay back, what's going to eventually happen? The old joke, you owe the bank $1,000, you have a problem. You owe the bank $1 million, the bank has a problem. It's true,
Right.
obviously. We owe so much money that everybody we owe it to, including, we owe it to ourselves, has a problem. But the reality is you can only go so much. The lesson of Bernie Madoff, of every pyramid scheme, is that at some point the whole thing
Right.
collapses. If you make it really, really big, you make it so big that it encompasses so many people, you're just delaying the inevitable. And this is what we're doing. We're delaying the inevitable. It doesn't mean that we're immune to gravity. It just means that it takes us longer to actually fall.
Do you think there's another option where the country doesn't fall, where maybe more enough people wake up to stop it soon enough before it comes to some sort of a financial collapse?
I certainly hope so. The Tea Party movement was about that in part. Unfortunately, it petered out. There was this period, this brief shining moment when Republican House and Senate leaders said that's enough. We're not going to spend crazy amounts of money. We're going to cut off pork. And they had some discipline. It was not nearly enough, but they had some discipline. They
Right.
cut back at least a bit. We've gone completely in the other direction since then. In the pandemic era, of course, the government just basically handed out checks to everybody who showed up. Don't worry, we'll give you a check. We'll give you a check. We'll give you a check. You go to the bank to apply, we'll give you a check.
Well, that's the craziness about all this is that everybody gets a check, but the problem is going to be that nobody has to write a check, and eventually somebody's going to have to write the check to bail it out. I just hope it happens sooner than later. Well, something I'd like to ask everybody during my interview is, a couple things. And they're kind of connected, but people answer them in different ways. Is what unites our country? What do you think unites us? Because I think that there's things in our country that unites everybody in there, and what makes our country great. And while they might go hand in hand, some people have two different answers. I'd love to see yours. What unites us and what makes our country great?
What used to unite us very much was our culture, our values, our history. This created the shared sense of what it meant to be an American. Unfortunately, that's been undermined over time in various ways that I don't think I even need to go into because we see them all around us. Increasingly, we're now an atomized country, a country of various groups operating in social media echo chambers, all urged to be very angry at each other, to pursue conspiracy theories, to blame the other guy, this person. Meanwhile, we tend not to see the big picture. We tend not to see the way forward. We know what we're against. We
Right.
tend not to know what we are for. And when you look at the founding fathers, they didn't just have a vision of let's get the British out, let's get King George III out. It was a vision of a positive vision of what we actually need to build. And that's something that's very absent. The left has a positive vision. I don't think the vision is positive at all, but they do have a vision of what they want to create. On the right, I often don't see that vision anymore. And I think that is a major catastrophe in and of itself, because so much of it is about reacting to what AOC tweeted. It's being outraged at this thing or that thing. Yet there's often the absence of a sense of, okay, we're conservatives. What are we conserving? What are we constructing? What are we building out of this rubble? That is often absent. And what we should be building, we can't turn back the clock necessarily. We can't go back to the 1950s. Though if I had a time machine, I would be definitely very tempted. We don't have that ability, but we do have the abilities to actually rebuild those principles, reclaim our culture, rebuild our culture around our values, and actually rebuild our values and our culture around our history to create that continuity. Because, there have been times in the past when things broke down and we got back up, we recovered, we tried to rebuild. We saw that after the catastrophic 60s and 70s, there was an attempt in the 80s and 90s to create something that was more stable, more conservative, more American, and then it was shattered all over again. And I don't see us actually rebuilding. I hope that the Tea Party movement, the MAGA movement, actually fulfills its promise of actually rebuilding what America was, because we actually do need to make America great again, and to do that, we actually need to reach to those values. We need to reach to our heritage and actually build a country that's worth fighting for.
I love that, Daniel. That's awesome. That's a great way to put it. I really appreciate that. Well, Daniel, are there any parting words that you might want to talk about? I'd love for you to also, again, in closing, in here in a couple minutes, again, how do people find out more about you? If they've liked this interview, they're going to want to read more about you. How do they find you?
Well, as far as finding me goes, I'm published regularly at frontpagemag.com, and my own site is danielgreenfield.org. There are a lot of good writers, not just me, at frontpagemag.com, including David Horowitz himself. And, as an investigative journalist, I think we're all investigative journalists these days. We're all trying to figure out what's going on. We're following the money. We're trying to puzzle out what is happening. And that is a really important thing. I think we are in an unparalleled era as far as just people scrutinizing authority, not taking things unquestioningly. And those are really important qualities. I don't want to take anything away from them. The boom in that is really, really important. One thing I would like to conclude on is what I've said earlier, which is that it is also important to think about not just what we don't want, what we do want. Fighting the left is really important. Fighting the people who have actually broken our country or demolishing it is vital. It's what I've dedicated my life to. But it's also important for us to think about, as you began by saying, the values that unite all of us, the conservatism in us, the ways that we can actually form common ground in which we can influence other people, because ultimately that is what it's about. Big tech, the huge social media platforms, they're all about breaking us up, dividing us, atomizing us. And they're very happy if, they're just 100 of us, 1,000 of us just talking to each other. It's important, as you said, to be able to talk to your friends who are Democrats, who are more liberal, and to actually figure out ways of reaching them and of making a difference. Because in the bigger picture, when we talk to each other, we can do something. It's powerful. But when we actually talk to somebody who doesn't agree with us and get them to accept something they didn't before, that's revolutionary.
Daniel, did you listen to my podcast? Because I did a podcast on exactly what you just said, which I would love to, if you listen to. It's about freedom and liberty. It's on my podcast channel. I have to send you the link. But I say exactly that. I said, when Republicans refer to the left, we're not referring to your average Democrat. We're not even referring to your average liberal-minded person. We're referring to a far left wing, sect or division of that far left, even beyond Democrats, beyond liberals, of people that just dislike the country, and they will use the people that vote Democrat against each other and use them to promote their agenda just as much as they're against the people on the right wing of the spectrum. And as a result, if we really worked on things, on finding things that we have in common, and we realize that we have actually more in common than we know, we would be able to solve a lot more problems. And you said something that I said in my last podcast, which is find the people that you disagree with and don't try to change their mind. Instead, talk to them about what we have in common. And then you slowly tell them things that you know to be different than maybe what they know. And before you know it, you've got mutual conversations where people realize that we're not so far apart and we can fight together for freedom and liberty for everybody in this country, and not just for our own ideologies, but for everybody's, even when we disagree with them.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly powerful.
You know, and do that. I would like if you can send me your links to your social media platforms. I'm going to share it. So anybody who's watching this video or listening to the podcast, they're going to be able to also check my sites, and I'm going to start promoting you a little bit more on this too. You know,
Absolutely. I would really appreciate that.
Well, Daniel, when I end the broadcast, I'm going to talk to you off air here for a minute, but I want to give you a chance one last time. Anything else that you want to say?
I think that's a pretty good note to end on.
I like that, Daniel. Thank you very much. And everybody else, please, after you listen to this podcast, it would mean a lot to me to share the podcast, or share the video, whichever you would prefer, because as a small organization, a small media presence that I have, I think it's really important to find things that we can unite on. And while big tech gets a lot of the conversation and steals it from a lot of people, it would mean the world to me if you really believe in freedom and liberty. It would mean the world to me to share this with other people, because myself and, as you saw, Daniel Greenfield, we have things that want to bring people together. We want to share things that will help our country in unique ways. And it would mean a lot to us if you'd share it. Appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And stay tuned for some more episodes coming soon.